Poor Peven and the Cyfo, a 10-minute short story, fairy tale, from the Tales of the Sacred Sword. Poor Peven was so poor, he had to use a hemp rope for a belt. His pants were baggy and would fall down without it. Those pants were handed down from his father, as were all of his clothes. Poor Peven worked every day to feed himself and his elderly mother. Every day except for Seven's Day, of course. No one worked on Seven's Day, for everyone was at holy service. Everyone except for Poor Peven. Even though he was not working on Seven's Day, he knew there was another way to make money. Spring had returned and brought back the morning songbirds with it. More importantly, it had also brought back something else. The Shire mushrooms only grew deep within the darkwood forest, in the shadows of newly budding darkwood trees. In the finest restaurants, rich folk dined on fancy soups and salads, with Shire caps as the main ingredient. Those salads and soups cost more than Poor Peven could earn in a moon. The darkwood forest was nearly empty. The further he wandered in, the darker it got. The heavy canopy blocked the light of the sun. It was also more likely he would get lost, but also more likely to find the elusive Shire mushroom. For the mushroom only grew in the darkest shadows of the darkwood trees. As he wandered, so did his mind. Poor Peven thought of the one-room shack that he and his mother lived in. His pillowless bed was made from scratchy old hay. His bathroom was a full 2-minute walk from the shack. 10 minutes for his mother. They didn't even have a window. Not that the sun couldn't get in. The dozens of holes between the size of a finger and the size of a fist let the sun in at all hours of daylight. Those same holes also let in rain and snow. Poor Peven and his mother had no blankets to keep them warm. Instead, Poor Peven piled rags on top of his mother at night, then threw the remainder on himself. If Poor Peven could find enough Shire mushrooms, they could live in a normal house. One where the sun shined through the window, instead of through a porous roof, and an outhouse adjacent to the regular house, and pillows stuffed with feathers, and blankets filled with down. Something caught Poor Peven's eye, something small and white, no larger than a child's pinky finger. He bent over. A stem of a Shire mushroom. Someone had picked the mushroom. Not more than a pace away was another stem, then another, then another. Poor Peven followed the trail of stems. Someone had been here already. He couldn't imagine who would travel this far from the city to look for these. Even though they were picked, it was a good sign. A sign that more mushrooms were nearby. Poor Peven followed the trail of plucked stems for an hour or more. The darkwood forest was a cacophony of low-volume sounds, crickets and critters and movements of many unknown things. Poor Peven ignored them all. But there was one sound, a new sound, he could not ignore. A voice, somewhere between a man and a child, hummed a tune. It was peaceful but lively, familiar, yet Poor Peven knew he had never heard it before. He crouched and moved through the thick forest towards the sound, always keeping behind the trees as not to be heard, always stepping slowly to not be heard. In a clearing, a little man sat with his back to a great darkwood tree. He was less than half the height of an adult man. With his white double-breasted vest, wool overcoat, and top hat, He looked like a child dressed as a lord. Except this child had a bushy white beard and a face lined with grooves that can only be formed through laughter, loss, and living. This was no man nor child. This was a Cyfo, a creature created by the god Purus. The Cyfo produced a mushroom. With a flick of his thumb, he popped the cap off the mushroom. The cap flew into the Cyfo's mouth, and he stopped humming, just long enough to swallow. Then his humming continued. Poor Peven knew a couple things about Cyfos. Firstly, they were incapable of lying. Secondly, they were near impossible to catch, for despite their stubby legs, they could run like the wind. Finally, and most importantly, Cyfos were wealthy beyond measure. Keeping a wide berth, Poor Peven circled behind the Cyfo. Then he crept closer. All the while, the Cyfo's humming covered the sound of Poor Peven's steps. Once he was behind the tree, he waited. The Cyfo popped another cap in his mouth, and Poor Peven pounced. He held the Cyfo in his arms like a father holding a babe. The Cyfo squirmed like two cats in a sack, but it was no use. Poor Peven had gripped him in his arms. "Where do you keep your treasure?" asked Poor Peven. The terrified Cyfo pointed deeper into the forest. "Lead me there," demanded Poor Peven. The Cyfo led him deeper into the darkwood forest, to places no man had wandered in a generation. Poor Peven made a good mental note of where they were. They stopped in front of a tree that looked like every other tree in the forest. "Your treasure is buried here?" asked Peven. The Cyfo nodded. His eyes filled with terror. Poor Peven almost felt sorry for him. "How far down?" The Cyfo held up 10 fingers. 10 feet deep?" asked Poor Peven. The Cyfo nodded. Poor Peven pondered his predicament. 10 feet below him was the Cyfo's treasure. More riches than he could earn in 10 lifetimes. Yet his shovel was at home. He'd never be able to dig that deep with his hands. Yet he knew Cyfos were as clever as they were honest and rich. As soon as Poor Peven let go, the Cyfo would run away. Poor Peven looked down at his tattered baggy pants and formed his plan. "If I tie my belt around this tree, do you promise you won't untie it, or touch it, or do anything to remove it?" asked Poor Peven. The Cyfo shook his head up and down. Poor Peven released his grip on the Cyfo. The Cyfo's little legs sped him away as fast as a horse. Within seconds, he was out of sight, buried deep within the darkwood forest. Poor Peven took his belt off. It was a stretch to call it a belt. It was just a span of hemp rope. He made a mental note of the location, then rushed home to get his spade. Once Poor Peven dug up the Cyfo's treasure, he and his mother would live in a palace. One where the sun shined through the glass ceiling instead of a porous roof, with indoor plumbing and ivory walls, pillows stuffed with cotton, and blankets made of silk. Holding up his pants with one hand, he ran back to his shack, grabbed his shovel, and ran out the door without acknowledging his mother. He kept a steady pace into the darkwood forest, past where he found the stems of the shire mushrooms, to where he heard the Cyfo's hum, and to finally where he tied his belt around a tree. The Cyfo had kept his word. He didn't untie the rope or touch it or do anything else to remove it. What he had done was tie another identical rope around every tree in sight. Poor Peven leaned on his shovel. His mind and body exhausted, he looked around. There had to be thousands of trees with hemp rope tied around each. Defeated, he wandered home. Perhaps he would find some Shire mushrooms along the way. It wasn't the first time a Cyfo tricked a man, and it wouldn't be the last.